Well, first off, thank you so much for coming. So I am a cultural studies researcher who, as Carolina mentioned, has recently moved to Warwick and to the UK. What a time to be a migrant. To introduce myself, I thought it would be nice, maybe sort of a bit indulgent on my own behalf, but to take the opportunity to reflect on some connections between my earlier work on femininity and online relatability that I did as part of my PhD and post-PhD, and then to kind of my more recent work on the politics of belonging in online feminism. So I was prompted to do this because I did a talk more recently where I was just prompted to think through some of the connections which seem otherwise more difficult to see in what, in my reckoning, were quite disparate bodies of work. But once you start delving into it, I think there are some kind of interesting or similar questions for me. So those connections for me centre around the politics of legibility. So the politics of, I guess, what is sayable and representable, normativity, and the affective pushes and pulls on what is considered desirable, likeable, and common for young women, and how such shifts occur through the relational address of online publics. So I'm going to start off with relatability. So to take you back to my earliest work, so in the early 2010s, I had been drawn to a US-based Tumblr account, Tumblr being a really popular platform at that time, maybe not so much anymore, but a US-based Tumblr account called What Should We Call Me? This was the header that I've just put there. So this was a Tumblr that helped two best friends in law school on opposite coasts of the US keep in touch through GIFs. So What Should We Call Me had gained a profile outside of Tumblr, which was unusual because it's usually quite an anonymous sort of inward-looking space. But it had been written up in women's magazines, in Forbes, and had also, this particular account had inspired many imitations at the height of meme culture in the early 2010s. And according to the two young women who ran this account, who were self-identified best friends, the popularity of this Tumblr was all about self-deprecating humour. So in this Tumblr, experiences were always recounted humorously. Waking up next to a surprisingly hot guy after a big night out, being really awkward at flirting, or hating on other girls who dared to talk to your ex. They often took the format of expectation versus reality, explicitly naming some idealised standard of femininity, then showing how one was an abject failure to live up to it. Yet the sheer exaggeration in the reality GIF, so the what I actually look like or what my reality is actually like, tended to suggest that this knowing hyperbole was also part of the joke. So one most likely did not resemble a dog more than a human. But the joke was about endearing the self to others, in identifying feminine ideals that you aspired, knew, but never quite matched up to. And so what I found intriguing, and thus began investigating in this research, was how this Tumblr, through these pithy, humorous descriptions of a fairly narrow stock of experiences, had invited so many others to relate to the joke. Ostensibly a dyadic relation between these two best friends, this Tumblr account, through an open and indefinite address, as Michael Warner might put it, had inspired a proliferation of spin-off accounts narrating the self through the same medium of affective moments through GIFs, but according to similar themes. So these spin-offs adhered to much of the same parameters of self-expression, articulating abundant, always available heterosexual desire, showing one was normatively feminine in loyalty to one's female best friend, but not to other girls who dated one's ex or cut in on one's ground, giving off vibes that one was nice, goofy, but hyper-aware of feminine ideals of grace, elegance, and beauty. So ultimately, this was to be superlatively average, in the middle, in an exceptional way, to show that you were still literate in the codes of white middle-class femininity and bound in optimism to that ideal, but continually avowing your minor flaws and failures in the everyday. So while the invitation of this mini Tumblr culture was to relate to a common experience, the range of experiences and affective positions within them were quite narrow. The rules of feminine online relatability did require, sunny self-deprecation, acknowledging troubles but not major ones, and to only share useful frustrations, i.e. challenges that you could make a joke out of. Fundamentally, the main interdiction was on being a downer. So more common experiences than being the most attractive betches in the room were not necessarily speakable in this paradigm. Notably, while campus culture was the main referent, given the age of the original Tumblr account creators, there was no reference to otherwise common experiences of on campus. So there was no reference to unpleasant sex, post the recession of the late 2000s, the grind of managing a paid job and study, or perhaps never even finding a job. Rather, this culture exemplified the shift to influencing as a paradigm in which lines between branding and self-presentation become definitively blurred, as articulated in the title of Christina Scharf's recent article, Are We All Influencers Now? Fast forward to the work I've done more recently, I felt I'd temporarily put a pause on these questions when I began pursuing a broader project more explicitly. Yes, when I began pursuing a project on online feminism. In the years following the completion of my PhD, it was clear that feminism was undergoing a transformation in its public circulation in Anglo-American culture. From 2014, when Beyoncé came out as feminist, which is apparently also the year that girl boss emerged in the everyday vernacular, there was a significant mainstreaming of feminism in public culture and political life. So this, for many feminist media scholars and observers, felt quite different to well-documented understandings of post-feminist media culture, in which feminism always had to be held at a distance from one's identity, particularly if your identity had a relationship to womanhood. This was a time of both ascendant discourses of women's empowerment, as well as in the Hollywood-led resurgent visibility of Me Too, continuous frontline coverage of widespread sexual assault and abuse. So in this shift to what Sarah Benet Weiser called popular feminism, as a smart, aspiring and realistic young woman, why wouldn't you be feminist became the question. Being feminist became much more of a mainstream taken for granted identity, particularly for those aspiring to participate in public culture or the professional workforce in some way. And so to outwardly deny feminism in these terms was increasingly to show one's ignorance or to be behind the times. And so in this context, I became interested in what feminism meant on an everyday basis in a highly mediated culture. So online platforms, were not only points of contact with activism, as was, showed a lot of the earlier research on feminist online culture, but as I saw it, also cultures where the meaning of feminism itself was being negotiated and redefined. On this slide, I'm just showing you, these are some Australian influences that my participants in some of these, like other projects, identified as feminist influences that they found were notable, they followed and and also admired, ambivalently in some cases. But so the economies of social media meant that online feminism also had to encompass cultures of consumption, learning, navigating, as well as instances of discrete issues-based activism. So I wondered then how these newer online feminist cultures shifted the legible terms of the gender contract for those who identified as women or had some kind of relationship with womanhood and identified as feminist at the same time, beyond the kind of post-feminist and popular feminist norms that had been previously documented. So my first project in this area, a pilot, was to identify some themes in what feminists who engaged in online feminism learned about feminism, how they redefined it, and the key kind of principles that they identified. So this meant for me a turn to primarily using interviews combined with various media elicitation methods to understand feminism's impact. And so what transpired at first felt really different to the Tumblr cultures of what was legible in terms of femininity. At this point in the late 2010s, what defined my feminist participants' orientations to feminism were keen desires for knowledge, to know, to learn better, with online culture as a key mechanism to achieve this. My participants read voraciously. Some gave me lists of dozens of accounts of activists, news organisations and NGOs they followed to keep on top of things. But this wasn't simply knowledge driven by curiosity, but a keen sense of the stakes of not knowing. As I went on in my research, I found these stakes coalesced in everyday conundrums: who to follow, who to stop following, hesitations to press like or publish on a post, the fear of being positioned as problematic or worse, and a continual quest to be intersectional, that is, perfect or exemplary in one's behaviour. So this is where I start talking about intersectionality as a concept in kind of a different way that you might use it in scholarly practice, but this is just to reflect the way in which it materialises in online culture. So in line with what many scholars have noted in relation to debates about intersectionality as a travelling concept across disciplines and across institutions, across borders, intersectionality in many places has become conflated with inclusion and diversity, as opposed to kind of a framework for theorising multiple existing differences. But what became really notable in my work with participants was that it also became an internalisable standard against which an individual person could be benchmarked and found failing. So the recurring question to which many of my feminist participants turned was, how intersectional are you in your politics? How intersectional can you be? So the question of diversity inclusion, but turned further inwards. And what is notable in these vernacular understandings, developed and circulated through online culture, is how intersectionality became highly regulatory and individualised. Against a backdrop of popular feminism, as well as renewed interest in documenting gendered harm, this translation of intersectionality shows how online knowledge cultures both aim to inform but nudge towards aspirational identities. A concept theorising oppression becomes a normative personal goal to achieve better inclusion and take account of oppressions in one's life. So seeing this, I saw that feminist online culture can do many things. On the one hand, it could help you make sense of your own experience and make your life and questions feel more legitimate. It could help you understand that your experience might also be very different to those of others who also perhaps identified as feminists for different reasons. But it could also reinforce, legitimate and hold my participants to homogenizing idealized attributes of white middle class femininity that it otherwise sought to dismantle. So thus, when I started thinking more about possible connections, I began seeing some continuities in the kinds of regulation and narrow parameters of gender that have been imposed in these feminist cultures, as well as the less obviously politicized relatable cultures that I investigated some time ago. And these are connections that I've just been making really now. So, this is just recent, but as a young feminist, you still had to be nice. But instead of self-deprecating humour, you had to make sure you didn't take up space and stayed in your lane. If you took up the most available understanding of intersectionality as a hierarchical linear grid of privilege and disadvantage, but you had to visibly include. You had to always make sure that other people could sit at your table when it was understood that you were the host. So that kind of understanding of the self as host was obviously not available in the same way to all of my participants. But while you had to lead, because it was so embedded in institutional culture that, young women had to be the voice of the future, you had to do so by amplifying others' voices and being a paragon of letting others speak. You couldn't demand others' emotional labour in asking questions about things you didn't understand. You had to educate yourself. And most of all, you had to avoid the pitfalls of girl bosses and celebrity feminists, other girls that got feminism wrong, often by being seemingly too selfish or too vain, according to standards to which men in the public eye are usually not held. So this is quite a lot of content, but I just have some concluding thoughts I want to end with. So in scholarship of intersectionality, that's been looked at how intersectionality travels as a useful concept and how it's been best used. So the key points of critique generally sort of focus on problems in its operationalization, a tendency to make it additive, a clunky formulation that makes it hard to address notions of difference across borders transnationally, particularly ones that don't fit sort of domestic multicultural configurations of difference. But these problems have still been theorised at the level of a broader structural understanding of what intersectionality can explain. But unfortunately, when concepts like intersectionality travel in online culture, while they can be really powerful, they, like the world, can also become personalised. So personalisation in this instance, meaning that intersectionality can become a heuristic to evaluate good individual choices, practices, and careful speech. Politics is boiled down to personality. And in contexts where the individual is firmly positioned as a standard political unit, from which perspective taking occurs, the individual becomes even more responsibilised and vigilant against getting it wrong. And so for many of my participants, while they couldn't not be feminists, it was anxiety-inducing to be feminist because the weight of the world was on their individual shoulders. And it was inexcusable to get it wrong, even as they explicitly discussed structural problems and collective change. So what struck me in thinking back to, I guess, my earlier work in conjunction with this more recent work is that feminism in its everyday translation, take-up and circulation does not straightforwardly excavate women from a bedrock of gender norms, considering how hard women have to work to be likeable, even and particularly when feminist, how earnestly they have to show they think of others in order to not be considered self-serving, how lightly they may brush across their own problems because other people have it worse. But I am saying this also at the same time acknowledging that we also live in a context where evidently some women who claim to be feminists feel emboldened to voice views that actively make the lives of other women and people with non-normative gender presentations unlivable. And sometimes also these online cultures, as anxiety-inducing as they are, still might feel relatively safe compared to the broader polarisation and the broader political climate we live in. So this isn't really straightforward what I'm arguing. But I think what I want to gesture towards is that, in contemporary media culture, when just the level of knowledge has really of terms has really kind of exploded, we can't rely on terms like structural change, intersectionality, and oppression in and of themselves. Or even identities like feminist and anti-racist do the work of unmaking injustice. In an online world which is saturated with words and with content and directed towards the manufacturing of identities, sometimes these words tend to simply contain experience. They turn experience into a keyword rather than actually elaborate them or think them relationally. And so, in conclusion, what my participants actually found most sustaining in a feminist sense for them were hearing narrated stories of the details and particulars of people's lives, of active conversations where they could be present but not necessarily have to find the words themselves. So we need to be sharing stories differently and to be able to listen differently. Perhaps, as Tanya Dreher says, to eavesdrop with permission on different conversations. And we shouldn't have to be funny, already knowing, fearless or inspiring or even relatable. We need to be able to share stories of exhaustion, our fears and our hopes to have gender and identity otherwise configured differently. And on this last slide, I just wanted to leave some links here in case anyone is interested in continuing this conversation. Was chatting with Chris just before. This is the podcast that I made that translated some of the findings of this last project on online feminism, and this is the book that's coming out in February, but I'm hoping to have a launch, so if you hear news of it, please do come along. Thank you.